studies. And one of the things we're doing this year, and one of the reasons why we've had these talks on LA's transportation, is that we're celebrating 100 years of transportation research at UCLA. So I wanted to share a little bit about that with you before introducing Peter. First, we acknowledge the Gabrielino Tongva people as their traditional land caretakers of Tavangar, the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands, and as a land grant institution, which means that the federal government gave land to states to auction off to pay for public education. We pay our respects to the Hanuvakatum ancestors, Aniharom elders, and Eohikin, our relatives, relations, past, present, and emerging. And we also acknowledge, and more recently, the Harvey S. Perloff Endowment provided funding for this lecture series. So we are the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. This is kind of the third iteration of a transportation research institute at the UCLA campus. And we do research convenings and support education at UCLA regarding transportation problems that are facing California, Los Angeles, and beyond. Just a bit about the history. The first university transportation center that we know of was established at UCLA in 1925. So that was the first research center at any university. The initial focus was street traffic. That was short-lived. They completely solved traffic in LA and then moved off, being sarcastic. But actually, after World War II, the state of California invested in transportation research as part of what it planned to do, and specifically traffic safety. And so UCLA's Institute of Traffic and Transportation Engineering was tapped to do research on traffic safety, environmental issues, and transportation engineering. And some of the first studies that showed that seatbelts were safer for car occupants than not seatbelts were done with crash test dummies by UCLA researchers. Actually, not some of the first, the first. In 1970s and 80s, this work, the research shifted towards social and behavioral aspects of travel, where it continues today. In the early 1990s, they established the current iteration of the Institute of Transportation Studies as a research center for policy and planning in transportation. And then we are now part of a 4-campus, multidisciplinary, cross-campus, statewide research consortium. So we'll be celebrating this history all year. In addition to, for folks joining online, especially in looking to endow our new Center for Parking Policy as the Shoup Center for Parking Policy. And so we're raising money to be able to do that. And so this series, this fall, is on LA's transportation past. And in envisioning this series, I thought, well, not all stories that are worth telling have been told or have been researched yet. So I wanted us to commission some sort of original work to understand what transportation was like for people in the past of LA who may have not had all of their, or in this case, we'll learn some of their experiences were showcased in the newspapers, but not all. And so we found somebody who was not so far from Institute of Transportation Studies, but somebody who had done some work on transportation history previously with us. And I've had the pleasure of getting to know Peter over the past 6 months and talking about this project and learning more about how historical methods work and Peter's approach to the work. And so I am very excited to bring you Peter Chesney of Vanderbilt University, who is going to be sharing with us the story of Peter Gallegos. Peter.
All right,
All right.
know when to come. Thank you for that introduction. That's wonderful. Can you hear me out of this? Yeah, okay. And I'm going to have a bit of a land acknowledgement of my own. This is something I learned in Canada. You can't just acknowledge where you're speaking. You should also acknowledge where you wrote it, okay? So anyway, thank you for having me. I wrote today's lecture on the ancestral hunting grounds of the Cherokee, Shawnee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creek peoples. Y'all might know this place better as Nashville. While I was conducting my research, I passed between UCLA on Tongva land and the headquarters of Guide Dogs of America on Tataviam land. I want to take a moment to acknowledge these nations and also to thank those of you coming from Guide Dogs of America. So thank you. Yeah, and thank you for your help with my research. Me being a settler is a reason that this opportunity arose. Another is that I had the opportunity to work closely in my final years at UCLA with Dr. Martin Wax. May his memory be a blessing. Marty had an incredible gift for thinking about city people in terms of the complexities of their relationships and lived experiences of being in the body. More than anyone else, he was the mentor who convinced me to begin thinking of feminism and family composition, growing up and aging, and access to medical care as integral to what we do in transportation studies. He helped me gain the confidence to center my positionality as a scholar with a sense impairment. I'm half deaf with total single-sided hearing loss in my left. The experience of disability has bound me in solidarity to the title figure of this talk. Peter, and we can call him different things. Gallegos, that's probably closer to how his ancestors would have wanted his name pronounced. But the more I did research on him, the more I realized he probably went by Gallegos, Southern California. They used to call Los Angeles Los Angeles. Anyway, he was a Pueblo worker with blindness. And by that, I mean he was native. This paper is about his and his household's accommodations between 1947 and 1959 to the spatial injustice that took the form of ableist structures built into the environment and institutions of post-war Los Angeles. But then something amazing happened. For the next 28 years, Gallegos disappeared from press coverage. This, I argue, is a signal that LA public transportation had grown more accessible during the struggle for disability rights. I index a selection of this movement's accomplishments, which were driven not by pity or publicity, but rather by activists seizing access to the halls of power where persons with disabilities secured invitations to raise concerns as partners in the making of a far more inclusive public sphere. Finally, I will conclude with a warning about the subtle stirrings of what I'm calling an ableist alignment between the right and transportation neoliberals and the abundance movement. I demand that we double down for universal design, and I have made a 3-point list of recommendations for transportation engineers and planners who are against ableism. Okay, back to Gallegos. How are we doing on picture? Ah, nice. Thank you. Nicely done. Here, let me just. Okay. Back to Gallegos. By telling his transportation life story and digging into the social complexity of being a Native person with a visual impairment living in post-war suburbia, I draw you into the lived experience of his mobility. And for this, I wouldn't have been able to do this without the example that Mark Vestal has established in his work on the Farleys. And Mark is right over there, so thank you. Anyway, Gallegos was not born with blindness. He became blind. In 1940, the US Census found him at the age of 28, residing in Santa Barbara, and listed him as a laborer in the construction sector. 10 years later, the census again listed him as a head of the household, but now he was designated U, or unable to work. In about 1945, Gallegos lost his sight. We can only assume that the job he'd worked placed him at a higher risk of workplace injury to his eyes. Today, construction workers wear safety goggles for protection from hot, sharp flying particles, but OSHA, or the Occupation Safety and Health Act, did not require PPE on the job sites like his before 1970. From the 1950 census, we know a number of specifics about the Gallegos' income. Peter had not worked or received wages in the past year. His other income amounted to $1,020 per year. These were aid to the blind payments from Social Security. Peter's wife, Pauline, a full-time press operator at a tile factory, accounted for the household's additional $2,000 in annual income. The Gallegos were members of the working class in multiple senses. While they earned only a few $100s less than the median household income for 1950, the two parents had little formal education, made a living on the basis of their manual labor, and probably chose to relocate to the blue-collar streetcar suburbia of the San Fernando Valley, at least in part because of its richness in public transportation offerings. Pauline Gallegos would not have had to walk far to the nearest bus stop. She and her neighbor, Encarnacion Holguin, also a worker at the tile factory, might have ridden the very same bus. This is on purpose. I want you to be able to focus on the words and not just look at the images, if you can see. The transit offerings of the era probably sufficed for Pauline, but Peter would not have found them all that usable. The scholarship about public transportation in the early 20th century in Southern California tends to highlight its awesome geographic range while minimizing outcry about the discomforts of using this network as the complaints of a bourgeois order too focused on comfort and quality. Streetcars tended to run down the middle of the road, so they required riders to walk through traffic and deftly scale protruding steps in order to get on or off. The public transit system hardly deserved the term because it was dangerous and inaccessible for residents of the city with motor and visual impairments. With the public implicitly not counting Gallegos among those deserving of city services, he and other persons with disabilities were forced to turn to the private sector for help with their rights to mobility. On Christmas 1947, he made his first appearance in the press as one of 3 recipients of a generous gift from a set of business leaders in downtown's Blue Front Club. This is how Gallegos got the first of his guide dogs, Greta. I want to take a moment to slow down because this is where the story takes a tragic turn. Out of respect for people who've been partnered with guide dogs, who are in this room, and who are tuned into this talk from afar, I want you to know how much care that I've invested in trying to understand the specifics of how dogs come to matter when we humans become kin with canines. I personally just spent 6 months as a puppy raiser for the Guide Dog Foundation. Our dog Buckley and I trained and walked together. We built an image and a great degree of trust. We more than metaphorically grew into extensions of one another's bodies. While we all prepare for dogs not to live as long as humans, none can fathom until it happens how awful it is either to be parted with one or worse, to lose such a companion to the violence of automobile infrastructure. Less than 2 years into her partnership with Gallegos, Greta got hit by a car and died. Gallegos had relied on charity and publicity once before, and now he turned back to the same kind of network for aid. The Valley Times, a suburban affair, championed the man that the LA Times had politely and simply named Peter P. Gallegos. But then the Valley Times used its headline to represent him as, quote, the blind Indian of Pacoima. The article falsely designated Gallegos a Sioux and pictured him in a staged, almost cinematic pose, wearing Plains regalia with no cultural relevance either to his own Pueblo heritage or to his children's California Indian heritage via their Mono or Paiute mother. As I show you this image, I want to provide you with what we in accessibility publishing call an image description. A man with open and uncovered eyes is sitting on a couch, staring to the side into the distance sadly. His son, sitting to his right on the same couch, is in overalls and gazing hopefully at him. His daughter, crouched on the floor at his knees, is wearing a braid and trying to cheer him with her smiling reassurances. The father has a Pendleton blanket draped thickly over his legs, a long wooden toy rifle in his skillful hands, and a headdress with a dramatic splay of feathers and two furs dangling at the ears. As I place this imagery before you, I turn to the contents of the news article. Before I read this to you, you need to know that I find the images conjured in the text to be as exploitative of disability tragedy as the photograph is of indigeneity. Quote, 10 years ago, Greta, the dog, was killed. Pete had gone riding in a car with a friend to see about repairing a radio. Pete is skillful enough to do that sort of work by sense of feel alone. A half hour after he drove away, Greta worried and fretted over his absence. She got out of the yard at 12921 Jouett Street and hurried down to busy San Fernando Road. She sniffed from parked car to parked car, vainly trying to find Pete. In her anxiety, her usual alertness deserted her. A passing car hit her and then sped away. She died a few minutes later, twitching in the gutter. Pete had lost more than a dog. It was like losing his sight all over again. His children were heartbroken, unquote. Looking back, I cannot say I approve of this imagery or this narrative style, but I can say with a nod to Dana Cuff that LA's absence of spatial justice, the public transportation system that seemed frozen in a state of malcompletion, and thus unable to adapt to the needs of the city's large, ability-diverse population, had left Gallegos and the philanthropists in his corner with a very limited array of workable options for raising the funds to get him a new guide dog. Before the motor age, people with blindness had not faced anything like the logistical dangers of walking in a car culture. When the Seeing Eye was incorporated back in 1929, founder Morris Frank had demonstrated to a crowd of reporters that the first guide dog in US history, which he had brought back from Europe, provided him with what I have been calling the dog power to counter so much horsepower on a busy street full of cars. Juan Matute helpfully noted in a conversation leading to this event that the timely emergence of guide dog training for blind city dwellers was probably in reaction to cities devoting more and more of their streetscape to ever faster and less predictable car traffic. In short, Gallegos had no choice but to regain access to dog power as quickly as he possibly could, and I cannot simply condemn the tactics deployed by him, by the editors at the Valley Times, or by the charismatic leader who sprang into action and helped design this sentimental publicity campaign. That man was the disabled machinist, Joseph Jones. He founded International Guiding Eyes, Inc. in 1948. Having personally gone blind in adulthood, Jones sought a guide dog from the Seeing Eye, but that rather bourgeois organization, mired in elitist ideas of the deserving versus the undeserving, deemed Jones too old to train. So he founded a rival organization on less ableist principles and branded it in solidarity with his labor union, the International Association of Machinists. This enormous and well-endowed organization advocated for workers in industries notorious for the high likelihood of eye injuries. In the spirit of class consciousness, IGE also committed to the provision of dogs at no cost to clients, not for the animal itself or for the month of residency at the training facility while the two learned their new dog-powered partnership. There's that term again. Unlike the Seeing Eye, IGE's dogs were not labeled as if they were an object or an inert mechanical sensor. They did so much more than see. They guided people. For they were care worker dogs with what we call more than human agency. Jones relocated IGE from the union's original stronghold back east to post-war Southern California, where IAM had a growing membership in industrial suburbia's aircraft industry. In this new geography, he committed the program to racial and international inclusivity. IGE partnered guide dogs with diverse clients, truly international. IGE supplied Gallegos, an internally colonized subject, with Bonnie in 1949, and Gloria Cruz, a post-colonial Filipina, with Anna in 1951. When Gallegos next appeared in the Valley Times 10 years later, he was labeled a quote unquote helping hand with a new dog named Chief. They were pictured repairing donated broken toys for regifting to children in need the following Christmas. Also at his side was one of a pair of orphaned siblings from the neighborhood who had lost their mother in a car crash 2 years prior. After all that, a network of public and private services invested in this father and his dog power, the article indexed the payoff for the community over 14 years, including about 5,000 toys fixed and regifted each year. While Gallegos had not formally returned to the workforce, he grew into an exemplary household care worker and an informal maintainer of the San Fernando Valley's material culture. With Chief, he gained the enhanced autonomy to stay home without the need for assistance from a sighted adult, which empowered his spouse to make her full-time entry into the workforce as a ceramicist and a long-distance commuter, leaving her husband as the homemaker. His blind gain translated into a dexterity of the fingers, which mounted a social justice intervention when he extracted a second life out of commodities doomed to the landfill and then made them available for free to households with no money to spend on toys. Dog Power equipped Gallegos with attention to spare for care work with the 2 adopted kids of color who otherwise faced alienation from this slice of the new suburbia. From the Valley Times alone, I would not have realized the degree to which Chief generated substantial emotional labor for the Gallegos family. To that end, I used an interpretive technique that ethnographers call upstreaming. When we find a rich source of recent vintage, either on paper or in an oral history, we can read it as a key for decoding rather scanty evidence from long prior. I would say that this photograph is scanty. Here's an image description. It features a man, Peter Gallegos, in dark glasses, standing at his work table and fixing a toy train car. To his right is a 5-year-old girl, Rosie, sitting on the table and looking closely at a similar toy held in her hands. To Peter's left is a German Shepherd named Chief. Chief's front paws are on the edge of the table. His mouth is slightly agape, his ears are erect, and his eyes are looking directly into the photographer's lens. Now, I want you to keep examining this picture as I read excerpts from a letter posted in 2002 that I found in the Guide Dogs of America archives. Their client, Jeff Johnson, sent his warm thanks from Thousand Oaks for service to his whole household by Cinnamon. Quote, "It has taken me almost 2 months to write you this letter. As I write, my heart aches and tears continue to pour down my face. 10.5 years ago, you gave me one of the greatest gifts I've ever received, second only to my wife and 2 daughters. Cinnamon was family. She was one of our children. She welcomed both her new sisters home from their birth with licks and kisses. Sterling, our oldest, tells us all the time how much she misses Cinnamon. Whenever Sterling got hurt, she would ask for daddy kisses, and Cinnamon loved hugs. Faith, our youngest, asks where Dadu is. We tell them she's in heaven waiting for us. Words alone could never express what Cinnamon meant to my family and me. She was truly a gift from God, and you delivered that gift to us." And this is Jeff Johnson. Now, what I'm going to argue here is that we can use this letter to consider how the dogs in the Gallegos household, Chief, Bonnie, and Greta, were not merely mobility devices for Peter, but they were also parentified kin to the children in the household, both the ones who were born and the ones who were adopted into this household, which I don't think could have been adopted without this dog. After 1959, Peter Gallegos mostly disappeared from the textual record of Southern California. Databases tell us that he remained with his family at that very same address in San Fernando, and since his death in 1987, his remains are still there in the Mission Cemetery, next to Pauline's. Typically, the historiography of North America's First Nations decries disappearance as a trope in accounts of American Indian history, so I apologize for this element of the argument. However, the disappearance of Peter Gallegos signals mobility justice. He no longer had to resort to what I'm calling the toxic disability visibility in order to secure the services he was due as a resident of LA County. Not only had he established an enduring relationship with IGE, but also he outlived LA public transportation's legacies of spatial injustice. Maybe not all of them, but a lot of them. Before Gallegos had first gone blind, the city implicitly confessed to the inadequacy of its transit services in issues of Two Bells, the monthly magazine for operators of the LA Railway. Before World War II, a regular feature called Bouquets celebrated and pictured motormen who'd gone above and beyond in their duties. Engineer O.G. Mackenzie received such plaudits in July 1930 for, quote, courtesy and kindness in showing a blind man and a woman to the curb. As grateful as this pair might have been for his help, they ought not to have had to depend on an altruist stepping out of his vehicle to be able to get to the curb. These riders were entitled to a conveyance designed such that they too were able to use it safely. Now, I'm displaying two photographs that show how much more usable the new post-war buses would have been for a client like Gallegos than the former fleet of streetcars in LA. The latter required riders to ascend roughly half their height by mounting a succession of 3 steps, the first from the uneven surface of the street, the next 2 with slightly different heights from the one prior. Both blind and sighted riders surely often tripped while getting on and off these machines. Entering the bus, Gallegos would have confronted just a single, much less extreme step from the curb into the machine. LA Public Transit began its long, slow transformation into a model for mobility justice during the 1960s. Top-down pressures from afar contributed to the shift, moves to dismantle the nation's fleet of rail-based streetcars in favor of public buses began a process that culminated in 1968 with Southern California Rapid Transit District's decision to allow free fares for blind riders as long as they were carrying a white cane. Finding the fare box and calculating fares had remained a significant barrier in Los Angeles and in the United States. The occasion for this shift in policy was the looming passage of ABA, or the Architectural Barriers Act, which DS scholar David Serlin has deemed the first example of federal accessibility legislation. The law went into effect on August 12, 1968, but LA implemented its new blind mobilities policy, that's what I'm calling it, on June 1st and gave momentum to one side in this transpiring congressional debate. For the rest of the Gallegos' life, he enjoyed the right to free mobility by bus. At first, drivers were trained to see a blind rider's white cane, and then soon after, they were also trained to see the pairing of a blind rider with a guide dog as proof of blindness, basically as their fare. Another source of the pressure making LA public transit more accessible arose from the bottom up. Advocates like wheelchair user Dennis Cannon used a 1975 newsletter to exclaim, quote, "We are only asking for buses designed for people, not mountain goats." So the job wasn't done yet. The equipment still needed to be updated. He and others in disability rights were in the early years of building a relationship with a kind and approachable elected city official named Tom Bradley. Norma Jean Vescovo, an early leader in Southern California's independent living movement, fondly recalled the first time that councilperson Bradley had received her and others in a disability delegation, including 2 with motor impairments. 4 years after ABA passed, they decided to test City Hall's accessibility in 1972 without any prior warning. A Bradley aide found them and agreed afterward to schedule an appointment with them, with the councilperson. From there, a coalition formed between anti-racists and anti-ableists that helped get Bradley elected the next year as LA's first Black mayor. He ordered the installation of ramping in City Hall and established an office for the handicapped. In 1985, disability rights was in its turn to the reform of language, and Bradley went with calls to change the name to the Office for the Disabled. So sensitive to the interests of constituents with disabilities, Bradley's leadership in this sector set the stage for a degree of mobility justice that made LA into a disability model city in the late 20th century. This is not, of course, to say that LA immediately or even gradually activated universal design in public transit. No US public transit reached such a utopian plateau in those years, or has since. But what I found in the Mayor Tom Bradley papers at Young Research Library is the proof of a city that took complaints about accessibility deficits in good faith and prioritized the disability positionality in discourse about such key transportation matters as parking and bus riding. It had been years since LA had once disastrously tried to restrict public parking from downtown in 1920. Bradley was not afraid to try taking spots away again, especially from the population of able-bodied drivers, and then to reserve a selection of the choicest spots for disabled drivers and passengers with parking placards. Bradley was also willing to inconvenience the population of able-bodied bus riders who now had to share this service with wheelchair users. Delays due to the usage and installation of lifts and straps did impact the speed and timeliness of bus service, but the performative and pedagogical value of this everyday drama bound riders of all abilities into what I'm calling a counter-ableist block. Think about the reading of bus confrontations over segregation in the prehistory of the Montgomery bus boycott in Race Rebels by Professor Robin D.G. Kelly. Buses had become moving theaters, deconstructing the absurdities of Jim Crow. In LA, buses also emerged as the stage where all the city's riders learned to see public transit as a network belonging foremost to those most in need of mobility justice. As a daily transit commuter who rode light rail and buses to UCLA while I was a graduate student here, I can say that nothing other than losing my hearing in a traffic collision has done more to radicalize me into disability studies and advocacy than sharing space on those conveyances with my fellow Crips. The bus is both public transportation and a social and cultural space of solidarity building and identity formation. Starting in 1976, on August 17th, a Tuesday, LA installed its first ever official blue curb parking spot along a public street. Bradley had just signed an ordinance affirming the city's commitment to create this new category of restricted parking for drivers with a special issue license plate from the state's DMV. The original spot graced the east side of Main Street, just north of the bridge linking City Hall and City Hall East. The mayor ceremonially removed a hood from the parking meter with signage featuring, quote, a profile view of a wheelchair with an occupant in white on a blue background. Who knows how many of the advocates who came to meet Bradley at his offices for the handicapped or the disabled parked right there during the remaining 17 years that the mayor held power. At first, the only recipients of these privileges were the quote unquote motor impaired. But after July 1st, 1978, California made special plates and blue placards available to optometry and ophthalmology patients whose central visual acuity did not exceed 2200 in the better eye. Since Gallegos disappeared from press coverage and the applications for these parking privileges is a matter of medical privacy, I cannot say for sure if he acquired such plates or a parking placard. That said, Gallegos would have qualified for these privileges. We can safely imagine him during the final 9 years of his life, riding at the side of his wife or one of his children in a car that's license plate or placard boldly announced its user's disability status as the car moved through the LA landscape, when the car came to a stop at a blue curb, and when the car remained unticketed in metered or otherwise time-limited parking zones. These changes in automobility made driving better for people with blindness who had the privileges of car access and access to the assistance of an intimate or a volunteer or a paid worker ready to give them a lift. But disabled people seeking independence at an affordable rate needed more from their bus network. LA delivered. In 1978, a partnership between the county-level rapid transit district and 2 consultants with the Braille Institute created a new O&M, or Orientation and Mobility, program that was worthy of coverage in the journal Visual Impairment and Blindness. In 3 waves, they confronted the problem of communication breakdown between bus drivers and blind travelers, what they called blind travelers. First, an RTD representative came to the Institute for a Q&A where clients raised complaints about drivers who either questioned their disability or sometimes insisted on refusing payment from riders who, in fact, wanted to pay. RTD returned with a bus to the Institute. Quote, "The students were allowed to examine the bus and board it. Then the bus traveled around the block several times, allowing small groups of passengers to get off and be picked up along the way without the pressure of navigating around rushing, sighted riders or drivers." Finally, a representative with blindness went to RTD's Drivers Training Center for an instructional Q&A about blind mobilities, and then they kept this for years thereafter. 2 years later, LA County Transportation Commission was reviewing RTD's progress toward compliance with Section 504 and convened another of these focus groups where bus riders with visual impairments got to voice their complaints. Turning away from the drivers, these riders emphasized the design flaws of LA's fleet of buses. The steps were still too steep. The interior needed a PA system listing upcoming stops. The lighting at doors and stairwells was inadequate for partially sighted riders, and the steps needed edge marking stripes and non-skid treads. Participants took the chance to praise the local providers for allowing guide dogs on board and singled out RTD for its required 2-hour training sessions for drivers on sensitivity and the needs of both elders and blind riders. Under Bradley, the Office for Disability diligently collected ephemera featuring best practices in anti-ableist and accessible transportation. They held on to a 1986 issue of Access featuring, and I'm going to call it an imperfect guide under the title, "Watch Your Language, Please." So they're telling you to watch your language, but then of course they're telling you to say things that are not acceptable today. It was by an LA social worker named June Isaacson Kayleys. This was an early foray into the critique of the medical model of disability and its replacement with a social or environmental model. She argued that, quote, "A handicap is the cumulative result of the obstacles that a disability interposes between an individual and her or his maximum functional level." With this philosophy in mind, she advised care workers to forego such dehumanizing phrasing as "a blind man" in favor of such person-first language as "a person who is blind in a job that does not require vision." So you can see how the Bradley administration is learning. They're studying. For the hub in 1987, Vescovo penned Transportation, in which she explained that public transportation alone did not satisfy the lifetime needs of her clients. While those with motor and visual impairments at the Independent Living Center received their initial O&M training, they relied on vans and other such paratransit options during the transition to independent living. The stage was set for the Mayor's Office of Disability to hold such confidence in the city's bus system that in answer to a request for a few dozen taxi coupons from a local charity for the blind, LA confidently replied no. In the year of Peter Gallegos' death, the RTD had become far more accessible than he might have ever expected it to be 40 years prior during the decade when he went blind. In the 1980s, International Guiding Eyes had also caught on to the importance of teaching bus ridership as a key element of the partnership between humans and guide dogs. These photographs of a group O&M on the airport shuttle at Bob Hope Airport, back when it was named Burbank, Glendale, Pasadena Airport, serve as an important reminder to anyone assuming clients of a high enough status did not need to learn bus riding. Undoubtedly, some of this era's people with blindness lived in an automobile-dependent life in suburbia, but then they found themselves trying to get on board a bus on their way from a terminal in an airport to a commercial aircraft. By photo documenting these scenes of clients walking down the bus stairwell with their companion species, IGE showed its enduring commitment to its roots in the crucible of labor organizing for the working classes. If any of the clients featured in these images might have previously balked at the idea of riding a city bus, they were probably much more willing to try after having had this experience. That's just one of the ways dog power intervenes in urbanism. Another is that blind women have expressed far more confidence and feelings of safety from harassment and assault when they travel by bus, train, or sidewalk with a guide dog at their side, even though that's not technically part of guide dog training. Now, I'm going to take a great leap forward another 4 decades to the 2020s to now. At this time, I contend disability rights is in a moment of danger. Improvements in medical treatment, legal interventions in favor of universal design, and all of us Crips coming together culturally to form a robust DS discourse all amount to advances. But we face an unprecedented threat in a new right-wing populist neoliberal alignment. I'm sure many of you already know about what the Center for American Progress is calling the Trump administration's war on disability. These targeted budget cuts and the language policing of our grant applicants have affixed a new letter to the trifecta of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The taboo is not just DEI, but now it's also DEIA, with A standing for accessibility. Those of us on the left are happy to struggle on this front. We'll fight back. But we feel betrayed, at the moment at least, due to the whisperings of an alignment between the outright ableism of the populist right and the subtler ableism of transportation neoliberals. No one speaks for this latter group quite so eloquently as Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, co-authors of Abundance. Now, while I appreciated parts of their best-selling book and the abundance movement has spawned, I found a few passages quite disturbing. On page 8, they relied on an ableist metaphor when dramatizing a complaint, quote, cries that government was stifling production or innovation fell on deaf ears. A blind spot emerged. To them, I say, as a deaf person sharing space with a number of blind persons today, hashtag, we're not your metaphor. Am I quibbling with them about language and sensitivity? Yes, and when they plant their neoliberal critique of government in the soil of ableism, they tip their hand and alert us to the logical conflation of what they think is an overactive government, disability, and matters of spatial justice. Then later in the book on pages 103 and 104, they proceed to claim that it is too hard to build housing in San Francisco because of all the agencies that will regulate the builder, they're writing for the builder, plans and their execution. Quote, you need an additional review from the mayor's office on disability. Who could oppose that? Question mark. Well, Klein and Thompson, evidently. Quote, but these projects already have to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the additional review takes time and comes at a cost, unquote. I'm left concerned that MAGA and Abundance are forming an ableist alignment against accessibility regulations. So I want to counter them with a list of suggestions for what I'm calling accessible abundance. I imagine Klein and Thompson would resent me splintering their post-scarcity consensus, but I can't help it after learning of the same occurring within pro-housing development YIMBYism. Max Holleran's Yes to the City documented how the Yes in My Backyard movement immediately broke into neoliberal YIMBY, socialist YIMBY, and even FIMBY subsets. So PHIMBY, I should clarify, stands for Yes to Public Housing in My Backyard. And that is the abundant housing agenda that has most influenced my thinking and my writing on housing. As this talk makes clear, I also feel fondness for public transit's history of accessibility. To that end, I unveil these anti-ableist mobility recommendations, having studied the histories of spatial injustice in LA during those years when Gallegos lived and moved through the city as a blind man. I will leave you with this, what I'm calling a program for multisensory urbanism and mobility justice. And what's on the list is municipal public transit agencies in LA ought to embrace a broader definition of transportation and thus contribute material support on a case-by-case basis for clients who cannot use public transportation without mobility aids and mobility training. Basically, what I'm saying is have MTA pay for what Guide Dogs of America does. They should be funding you too. But they should be funding all sorts of transportation-related, what they would consider to be health stuff. Number 2, transit infrastructure, including both train stations and bus stops, are far too oriented to the visual and oral experiences of people who can see and who can hear. We need to embrace more multisensory means of orienting users who might better navigate by touch and by smell. If you look at Japan, Tokyo, they have like really great tactile paving all over the place, so we could maybe just imitate what they're doing. And number 3, partnerships of difference involving a team of designers, each with a different disability, could be sponsored to design 4 generative prototypes, a train station, a bus, and a bus station, and they should be spared any oversight by able-bodied supervisors or pushback from able-bodied clients as they make these prototypes and put them into operation. And we can see how they work. Okay, thank you so much. I'm so excited for your questions.
Thank you. All right, I'll transition us here. Does anybody have questions for Peter? Good. Oh, okay. All right, I will start with one. So, you know, outside of this work, you've one of the other pieces that I've seen from you and Martin Wax and Yu Hong was about 100 years of fighting traffic congestion in Los Angeles. And I was wondering if you could share any perspective on what you learned from that document and preparing that document through the lens of ableism, or just understanding what people, planners, traffic engineers at the time were trying to achieve, perhaps colored or not colored by the Peter Gallegos story.
Sure. Thank you. Okay, I want to make sure I'm not causing any screeches. Again, thank you for your question. Thank you all for being here. One of the greatest outcomes of being put on that project with Marty and Yu Hong, who are both just complete geniuses. And Yu Hong, are you here? Good to see you. I learned so much about engineering from them, and there's just absolutely no way in which I would have learned engineering in the ways in which I learned engineering in my department. No offense, the history department's amazing, but they don't teach engineering. And so what that paper is a testament to the power of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work. I'm very grateful to Meyer and Renee Luskin for founding the History and Policy Institute in the history department that basically built this relationship between me through David Myers and all sorts of really interesting people in this building. It really opened my mind and made me into somebody who could think outside the history box, let's say, and think like an engineer, even though I'm not going to at all claim to be an engineer, but I think I can be engineering minded at times. And so what that paper did was, as I started to do the research that led to the recommendations in the paper, which were in favor of congestion pricing and doing a congestion pricing pilot in American cities, and now we're seeing one going into effect in New York, and I'm very proud of it. I think that they're doing really well over there. I hope we end up with one here in Southern California soon, too. We could really use it. But the argument that really convinced me, after all the research that I did and after all the perspectives that I learned on congestion pricing, was that we have to get cars out of the way of buses. And if buses don't arrive on time, just think about how inconvenient that's been for you, whoever you may be. Let's say you're sighted, right? The bus doesn't arrive on time. Well, you can stand there and look for it while you're waiting for it to show up late. But if the bus doesn't arrive on time when you're partially sighted, or if you're a person with blindness, you've just been completely disoriented. I mean, it's just infuriating. It is an indignity that nobody should go through. And if we can get the buses to show up on time, then we are making this ability or anti-ableist model city that I'm describing in this paper. I don't think we've reached that plateau. Of course, it's really hard to achieve true buses on time frequency and reliability. But what I found from the research that's being done on other parts of the world where congestion pricing has gone into effect is that the buses become more predictable. And we're also starting to see that in New York City as well. And not only are the buses more predictable, but drivers are less impatient, they're safer. And if there's one population that's most at risk of impatient drivers, it's people who are pedestrians, people who are bus riders, and especially disabled people who are much more likely not to be seen by these drivers. So anyway, the real outcome of that paper for me was building a logic and a consciousness for me where I started to see the importance of the bus that I had previously not studied, I'd only used. And this was my first opportunity to bring a kind of scholarly perspective to the history of busing in Los Angeles. And I started early doing research on jitneys in the 1910s. And so as I started to build this bus consciousness that was not just based on my personal life, but also based on scholarship and on my scholarly identity, that made it possible for me to come along and do a project like this, where I make such a favorable history of the bus. I mean, at the end of the day, I think buses are a better form of transit for a place like Los Angeles than rail. I think you should have both, of course, but if you have to prioritize one or the other, it just seems obvious to me in a sprawling city with so many blue-collar suburbs that those suburbs are going to be better served by buses than they're going to be served by rail. So have both, but buses seem to be better. And I think they're also, from what I've learned, reading more contemporary work on experiences of visual impairment on public transit, buses are actually a lot safer and more emotionally comfortable for people with blindness than trains are, because, you know, trains have the hole. You know, like you have to constantly worry that you're going to fall off the platform when you're visually impaired in a train station. You have to worry that you think you're walking into a door leading onto the train, but you're actually walking between two cars. Buses are actually a little bit easier to navigate in auditory terms, and the presence of the driver just makes it so much more effective for a person with blindness, that the driver can do that added work of at least vocally or auditorially cueing you as to where to go. Thank you. Great question.
Yeah. Okay. I do want to hear questions from the audience. Maybe you have 2 mics now, or do we have another one? We have 3. We have an abundance of mics. Over here in the back, there's a question. Angel will... Well, we have some people joining us online, and they'll probably prefer if they can get a good audio readout, because they may be having it transcribed and everything for them. So.
Okay. First of all, I just want to say, Peter, thank you for modeling how to make our talks more inclusive. As an academic, I learned a lot from you just now. This is kind of a rambling question, but that's the effect you have on me. And just flagging the fact that I am not a transportation studies person or a disability studies person, but a labor studies person. So I was really struck by the origins of the guide dog program in AIM, the machinists. I have a lot to ask you about with what was happening in the machinist unit at the time, but it really struck me when looking at that picture of Mr. Gallegos fixing the toy, this idea of the productive body. And to then sort of think about, you know, the restoring of the productive body, the treatment of the productive body. You talked a lot about care work, but I found myself thinking much more about the body of the worker, the productive body, and the way that they're showcasing in those early I mean, when he's holding the gun too, right? That's a certain kind of productive body. I was struck by the fact that the ascendance of Bradley's embrace of access around disabled folks coincides with the deindustrialization of Los Angeles economy and the rendering of hundreds of thousands of productive bodies into now unproductive ones in the classic proletarian sense. So, and then of course, at our current moment, this just like absolutely fascistic logic of the productive body being male and white and abled. I just wondered if you could back up a little bit to how you learned about the AIM origins of that program and what their sort of governing logic might have been, and then maybe riff on that a little bit. We are wont to riff, so I don't want to sort of take over this whole conversation, but if you could think with me through the sort of productive bodies, unproductive bodies, and labor's whole place in all of this.
Carolyn, I so appreciate your question. And everybody, Carolyn Luce is just a paragon of labor historians. Seriously, such a testament to what UCLA history can do in terms of generating these sophisticated perspectives and now questions. So it's been such a pleasure working with you and knowing you. Thank you for this question. Okay, so a couple things about labor. Okay, let's start with how did I learn about IAM? Guide Dogs of America taught me about IAM, because Guide Dogs of America remains very much in solidarity with IAM. IAM still supports Guide Dogs of America. If that wasn't abundantly clear from the talk, I should have made it more clear. So it will be more clear in the paper. When you go to Guide Dogs of America, I have to say for myself, it's not like I expected it to be a labor organization that had founded it, because I had this idea going into this project that usually philanthropic institutions have the backing of usually just like the super rich, basically, and therefore philanthropic institutions tend to have a very bourgeois perspective. And I walked into that building, and the first thought that I had was, you know, as I met people, like multiple people who are working people who have, you know, lost their vision, maybe for reasons having to do with their jobs and maybe not. What's so amazing about that environment is that working people lead there and participate in every aspect of what they do there. And then the point of the dogs is to get people back to work if that's what they want, but also to think very broadly about what work is. And I hope that's really clear from this presentation that I'm giving, is that even as LA deindustrialized, LA remained an extraordinarily productive landscape. It's not a landscape of industry with factories the way that it was during the war years, of course not. But the work that's being done in Los Angeles, whether it's people working in sweatshops, whether it's people doing the work of running all these buses, I mean, right? Public employment is a huge area of work. And whether it's the care work of dealing with a population that is suffering, especially in a place like Los Angeles, because of its history of industrialization, that bodies are suffering from all these injuries that are related to the work site or being adjacent to the work site, right? Like there's a reason why there's so much disability in Los Angeles and why there needs to be so much convalescence in Los Angeles, is that we have a landscape that's just poisoning people all the time and injuring people all the time. And the amazing thing about labor organizations, of course, is that they were the ones who taught us that an injury to one is an injury to all. So when people are part of IAM and they see a disabled worker, they don't just see, you know, some person to pity, they see themselves, you know, and that capacity that labor organizers have and activist workers have to say, you know, someone who's been injured, that is an injury to me, that is an injury to the people who need them in their immediate vicinity. And we need to get them back online, not by fixing them or curing them, but by making them autonomous so that they're not in Jasbir Puar's sense. I don't know if any of you have read The Right to Maim. You know, Jasbir Puar talks about debility, the fact that when people are taken kind of offline and can't care for themselves anymore, that somebody else has to care for them. And that debilitates not only the person who's been injured, but also the person who has to devote their time to that person and to the society that loses that productive capacity. So she uses Palestine as her example of a debilitated population where so many people have been injured in war by an army that is trained to shoot to maim rather than to shoot to kill, because they know that will be more debilitating to the population. So the reason why I bring this up is because I think what Guide Dogs of America is doing is it's treating this social relationship without creating this kind of romanticized belief in like a cure, but instead making it so that people can do the kind of work that they're going to be able to do after they've been injured and lost their vision, for instance, which I'm arguing is care work, you know? And I'm using the Hochschild's concept of emotional labor like very purposefully to say that when you are supporting somebody else emotionally, you are doing work. And just think about how much emotional support went into building and maintaining Los Angeles in the middle to late 20th century and into this century, that all that relational care work is also work and it needs to be valued. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Question in the back, and are there other questions I can queue up? So Angel, Jacob has a question and then we'll get to you. Thank you.
Thanks. I had a question about, I guess, verification of disability status in the systems we are in today. So our colleague, the late Don Shoup, we had a memorial for him last week, wrote about disability placards for parking and their use and abuse. On the one hand, it's sort of their abuse has made them essentially invalid. You can't find a disabled space in a lot of parking lots and areas because you have a placard that's been handed down generations or something like that that people use. But on the other hand, I mean, I think about this with like discounted and free transit fare programs, like the hurdles, the paperwork you have to go through to prove you're low income or disabled or whatnot dissuade a lot of people and make it hard to use. So, I mean, seeing eye dogs or guide dogs being another example of this, how do you balance kind of the need to keep the system working with the onerousness of proving the status?
Sure. Thank you for this question. I'm glad you brought up Shoup's work. I mean, I don't know if he has an article on this, but I've looked at the part of the high price of free parking where he talks about the abuses of disabled parking placards. I will emphasize, by the way, that when you could get a license plate from DMV or you could get a placard in the 70s, you got it for life. And they actually changed the program in the middle 1980s. So now you have to get it, basically recertified. And if you get better and your doctor says, okay, like you don't need this anymore, you were on crutches for a while, but now you don't need it, you will lose that placard. And the placards have years on them. So if you have an expired placard, an attentive member of law enforcement will definitely catch you using it and still ticket you, and you may even face much worse consequences. So we have addressed some of the issues of the abuse, but of course, it's still abused. And from the research that I've done, I think one of the trickiest elements of figuring out what to do about parking placards has a lot to do with how many different kind of levels of certification are involved with being the kind of person who can grant a parking placard. So the fact that you can give a parking placard as a heart doctor or an eye doctor makes a lot of sense to me. The fact that chiropractors can give out parking placards, I think reflects the history of chiropractic as a very powerful lobby in California. And I think some are very well positioned to say this person has back pain, they need a placard. And I think some are basically just taking payment to give out placards. So it's definitely a system that can be abused. And I'm certainly not going to say that, we can just look at this wicked problem, snap our fingers and fix it. But I do think that parking placards are necessary. And I can't say that I'm convinced by Shoup's solution to the problem, which he calls like lifeline passes. One of the things I learned from Marty about congestion pricing is that the moment we start to say to certain populations, okay, we have an exception for you, like you don't have to pay, we're going to give you a coupon so you can come in for free, the system is just going to fail. And the parallel, I think, is like when you look at certain global cities where you can get you can only drive into the center of town if you have a certain number at the end of your license plate, like even or odd or whatever. I think that's the case in some Brazilian cities, maybe some Chinese cities. What that leads to abuses too. People just get 2 cars, and so now you have even more cars. And so what I'll say is that I think the system's working as it is. I don't think it should be as hard to get the placard. But again, it will be abused if we make it too easy to get the placard. So, again, going back to this wicked problem, the solution, and again, this is the logic that I learned from Marty, is that when there's a disagreement, instead of just appealing to tradition, you go to the person in the case of someone who has memory, and you ask them, what did you do back then? And they say, we argued about it. I'd say, like, today we just need to keep arguing about it and keep trying to come up with a better way of doing this.
Okay, we have time for one more question before we have to wrap up right here.
Hi, I just want to say thank you for your talk, particularly around like disability advocacy in transit. As someone coming from a background with like sensory, multisensory disability, like how can modern disability advocates push for more like accessible transit when oftentimes they come into conflict with like the transportation agency's competing goals? I can think of like in LA, there's a reluctance for LA Metro to implement like platform screen doors or like level boarding on their BRT, newer BRT lines. Or like I'm thinking in particular respect to like safety, where, they're instituting a lot of like anti-loitering music at their stations or like high-pitched whines, that are particularly targeting unhoused folks, but, they're creating essentially space for people with like sensory issues are extremely uninviting, especially when frequencies are like 20, 30 minutes. You're waiting at a place that is meant to be like anti-loitering. And so how can we push for like better, like modern disability advocacy for these transportation agencies so that we design a system that's better, not only for disabled folks, but for all people?
Well, I'll start with a very simple answer, which is that I hope Metro hires you at some point to take this job on. I mean, seriously, I think that when I talk about sensory urbanism and sensory rights to the city, I'm taking these classic concepts that, people haven't really re-articulated in sensory terms in the past. I mean, I didn't ever see David Harvey do it, for instance. I think we can take those concepts, we can learn from those concepts. Of course, we're gonna have to transform those concepts as well. Urbanism is totally mired in ableism, right? When you hear the phrasing, the walking city, for instance, like, what is that supposed to mean? We know what that means to us, those of us who are not motor impaired, who are able-bodied. But those of us who have motor and sensory impairments, we hear that and we're like, is the city not for me? But the reality, of course, is that disabled people tend to congregate in cities. When they're not in total institutions, when they're not on these like farms that were built in the late 19th century, early 20th century, they're in cities because you can have more autonomy in the city. And so what I would say to public transit agencies is you have an enormous wealth of sense-impaired people in the city. Hire them. Bring them on, not just as consultants, because that's the easy fix, right? Contract everything, no actual permanent government employees. Like, you should have paid advisory councils with people with a variety of sense impairments, a diversity thereof, what Dana Cuff would call partnerships of difference. And that in those councils, there should be arguments, like enraged arguments between, and they should be open to that kind of emotion. Between people who would say, on the one hand, well, as a blind person, here's what I want. And then another person who says, as a person with blindness, here's what I want. I mean, right off the bat, we've got two people who, are bounded in solidarity and yet want person first or identity first language, right? And they're going to disagree about what's best for orientation and mobility on the bus and on the train as well. But let them argue it out and listen and let them lead. Because I think that's actually what we don't see enough of in transportation, honestly, at the government level, is that it's almost all able-bodied people who are running these institutions. And I think there should be a disabled sense-impaired person as a representative, probably more, on every board, just like there should be an Indigenous person on every board representing the interests that are not being taken into account when it comes to building and maintaining these structures. So yeah, thank you for your question.
Thank you. So I've really appreciated your talk today. I think it was, for those of us who live, breathe, and will die transportation, it was really opening to see the different perspective that was centered in somebody that I had not learned about prior to engaging with you and discussing what type of story we could tell here. So I really appreciate it.
And I appreciate you for inviting me. Thank you.
Please give Peter a hand. Oh, we will have more of these lectures. I think this takes a few minutes to warm up. So Nick Patsoras is a fixture from LA's history. He was involved with making the bus better in Los Angeles. He'll be coming on October 21st to talk about his book, The Making of Modern Los Angeles. This does not want to show you what I'm seeing on the screen. Here we go. On October 28th, our own Adonia Lugo will be joining us and sharing indigenous transportation knowledge from Los Angeles. And then on November 4th, we will have Professor Brian Taylor talking about fighting traffic congestion 100 years ago. So these are all available online at its.ucla.edu/events. So thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed it, I saw a few of you recording. We've also recorded this lecture on our YouTube channel, which is approaching 4 digits in subscribers. So you can see it there, share it there. It's a way to keep engaged with this material or some of the other lectures if you wish. And you can email us general inquiries or scan and join our mailing list. We'll be doing a lot of public events and communications this year as we celebrate 100 years in motion, advancing transportation research at UCLA. This is our first of what will probably be about 20 talks this year. So thank you for joining us. And just before you start networking, oh, Adam, you have something to say for the class?
Yes. So thank you, thank you, Peter, but please, like if you're enrolled in this course, do not leave without signing in.
Oh, yes.
If you want to get credit for these lectures, then come and talk to me.
Yeah, if you're a UCLA student. I think it's hard for us to give credit to non-UCLA students. So there was another, we are in a classroom. There was another class in here in like 15 minutes. So if you could, we can chat a bit here, but then proceed into the hallway if you find yourself continuing conversation that will accommodate one of UCLA's primary objectives, which is being a hub for learning. All right. Thank you very much for joining us today.